Hello and welcome to Washington Post Live. I'm Sarah Ellison, a reporter here at the Post. Today, it's my pleasure to welcome Professor Carol Anderson, who is the chair of the African American Studies at Emory University. Professor Anderson, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me, Sarah. I'm really looking forward to this conversation.
As are we. I want to dive right in and start by asking you about a new book out by political scientists Stephen Levitsky and Daniel Zablat. They open that book by juxtaposing January 5th in Georgia, that saw the election of a Black man and a Jewish man, both firsts for that state, to the Senate, and what happened the next day in the Capitol on January 6th. I'm wondering if you can put those 2 days in context for us when we look at the larger story of American progress and backlash.
What you see, to me, what you see with both of those is how they each had a very a long arc of grassroots organizing, a long arc of organizational planning, and a long arc of a vision of what America could be. With the arc that you see with the election of Reverend Raphael Warnock and Senator John Ossoff here in Georgia, the first African American and the first Jewish senators ever from the state of Georgia, you saw a vision of what a powerful multicultural democracy could be. You saw a vision of how we could actually work together, live together, thrive together. What you saw with January 6th was an assault on that vision because that assault began long ago. But also, what was so key in it were the lies, the big lie told about how African Americans and Latinos and Native Americans and Asian Americans stole the election from Trump. And you saw how the right wing identified Atlanta, Detroit, Milwaukee, and Philadelphia as the sites of that theft. Those sites really laid out that it was minorities who stole the election from good, honest, hardworking white Americans, stole something precious from them. And this is what you see in that anger that assaulted the Capitol to say, we're going to take our country back. This to fly the Confederate flag in the Capitol, to try to stop the counting, the certification of the Electoral College votes. Although this had been the fairest and the most accounted for, the most audited, recounted, rechecked election in American history, basically, because the lie of fraud is the lie of Black people corrupting democracy. And that is what Trump tapped into. He tapped into that, and we see it with that insurrection. And the way that African Americans have organized here in Georgia, we saw that with the election of Reverend Raphael Warnock and Senator John Ossoff. So you have a clash of two different visions of American democracy.
As we saw in the intro, you have said that American democracy's greatest adversary is white supremacy. Can you explain what you mean by that?
Oh, absolutely. I'm a historian. And so I look back, and so to me, the long arc is that during the War of Independence, there came a moment when the British had decided to hit what they called the soft underbelly, and that was to go south. And so they hit Georgia and they took Savannah like that. Then they were coming for South Carolina. George Washington sends his emissary, John Lawrence, down to South Carolina and says, okay, the British have 8,000 troops coming at us. You only have 750 white men under arms that are available to fight. 750 against 8,000. That's not going to work. You're going to have to arm the enslaved if we stand a chance of having a United States of America. And the South Carolina government said, oh, we would rather take our chances with the British. So you begin to think about that. So in this battle for American independence, the need to control Black people, the need to have slavery was first and foremost. It was alpha and omega for the South Carolinians, for the white South Carolinians. White supremacy was more important than the United States of America. We see that same thing with the founding of the Constitution, where the South is threatening to bolt, threatening to undermine the US Constitution if they don't get their way. And if they do, and their way is to be able to embed the protection and the enhancement of slavery in the Constitution. So the 3/5 clause, the additional 20 years of the Atlantic slave trade, and the Fugitive Slave Act. So those were the bribes to the South to make sure that there was a United States of America. So again, white supremacy. We must have white supremacy, and that's more important than the United States. And we're willing to destroy the United States if we're not able to maintain white supremacy. Then you have the Civil War. The Civil War was about slavery. The Civil War was about the South's anger that Abraham Lincoln was elected and that he was not for the expansion of slavery from sea to shining sea as the US was expanding. Again, willing to destroy the United States, willing to kill over 600,000 Americans in order to maintain slavery, in order to maintain white supremacy. We see that again with the Cold War. So there was this incredible moment after the Brown decision, and when the US, when the Soviets, when the Soviets had launched Sputnik, and the US clutched its heart because they're like, that means that the Soviets have the ability to send a nuclear missile across the sea, because Sputnik said, yes, they can. Yes, they can. And Eisenhower then pushed for sending massive federal funding to America's schools to beef up the ability to have what they call the workforce to be able to fight the Cold War, to have the educated workforce to be able to fight the Cold War. The South said, we want the money, but we will not educate Black kids. We will not educate Black students. We will not, we will not. And so again, Jim Crow, nuclear war. Jim Crow, nuclear war. They took Jim Crow over the threat of nuclear annihilation. That is what I mean by white supremacy has been the greatest adversary of American democracy since its founding. And we saw that again with the civil rights movement, and we saw that again with January 6th.
Um, It's so staggering when you put it out that way. I'm wondering if you can, we in the news business sometimes tend to treat this moment that we are in as unique. And I think it's fair to look at January 6th as something that is unprecedented. But as a historian, how would you describe this moment in time?
This moment is a crisis, and we have been in crises before. And so January 6th is not quite as unprecedented as we'd like to think it is. There was a multiracial democracy in North Carolina in 1898, in Wilmington, North Carolina. White supremacists were so angry about that multiracial democracy that you had Blacks and whites working together in government with a vision of how government could help everybody in terms of education, in terms of access to the ballot box. And so white supremacists attacked Black people, slaughtered them, said we will choke Cape Fear with the carcasses of Black people. And then in a bloody racial massacre, wiped out many, many in the Black community, and then stormed the citadels of government and demanded the resignation of the mayor, demanded the resignation of the police chief and of the city council, and then installed white supremacists in that government. And you had the governor and the president of the United States treating that illegitimate government, that coup government, as legitimate. We have had a coup in the United States before of a duly elected government. And so you saw that trying to be replicated with January 6th on a much larger scale. The question about the viability and the sanctity of Black American citizenship is what was on the line in 1898. It was what was on the line in 2020 with 2021 with the January 6th election. And so what you're seeing there is the denial of the voting rights, the denial of the ballot, the denial of the citizenship from white supremacists who say, don't count those ballots. Don't count those ballots in Fulton County. Don't count those ballots in Philadelphia. Don't count those ballots in Detroit. Don't count those ballots in Milwaukee. Those aren't real ballots, though, because those aren't real citizens. And so this is a long arc that we must deal with because American democracy is creaking under the weight of white supremacy.
Um, we're seeing economic conditions in the United States improve at a much faster rate than in Europe. And at the same time, partisan polarization is getting worse at a faster rate here. What do you ascribe that to?
I ascribe that to the kind of information ecosystem that we're in right now. And so I saw a poll that said that the right wing they get overwhelmingly get their news from a handful of sources, like Fox, like Newsmax, like OAN, whereas folks who aren't right wing get their news from a variety of sources. And so when you're in information econo- one I'm sorry, one information ecosystem, then what you hear gets repeated over and over. So what you hear is high inflation, and the immigrants are taking everything, blacks are taking everything. Those people are taking everything. The cities are on fire. It's dangerous. It's dangerous. And so what you hear is the dystopian vision of America, the sense that it's not working, that the economy's not working for you, that the city that you're not safe. If that's what you keep hearing over and over because you're not getting your information from a variety of sources, that is a key to the polarization. Whereas those who are getting their information from a variety of sources are hearing all of it. They're hearing about inflation rates that are low, about 3%. They're hearing about unemployment rates that have plummeted from where they were. They are hearing about the CHIPS Act that are bringing manufacturing jobs back to the United States. They're hearing about all of this. They're also hearing about the dangers in this society that's happening when you have a large group that no longer believes in democracy, that no longer believes that the election system will work for them, will give them the kind of America that they want. And so they're ready to look for alternatives.
I'm wondering if you can put today's GOP in context for us. To what extent is that an extension of Reaganism, and to what extent is it a break from Reaganism?
I think part of what we have to look at with the GOP is the Southern strategy, which was the attempt by the Republicans to woo in the Southern Democrats. The Southern Democrats was that section of the Democratic Party that was staunchly anti-black, staunchly anti-civil rights. And when you had the Democratic Party beginning to make moves towards civil rights, you started seeing that solid Democratic South begin to move away from the Democratic Party. The first real break came in 1948 when the Dixiecrats broke off from the Democratic Party. You saw more of this happening with Eisenhower's first election, and he broke off some of the solid Democratic South that voted for a Republican candidate because he made it clear he wasn't for Brown. Then you had the civil rights movement, where you had Lyndon Johnson then signing off on the Civil Rights Act and then the Voting Rights Act. That was the sweet spot right there. That is when you had the Republican Party really going for it and saying, wooing in the Southern Democrats. And Lee Atwater said it best. He said, Lee Atwater was a strategist for Reagan. And he said, in 1954, you could just say the N word and it wouldn't hurt you. But by 68, you say it and it backfires. And so you start talking about all of these abstract things like taxes and forced busing and states' rights. And all of them are so abstract. They're economic things. But the whole point is that Blacks get hurt worse than whites. And so it's how do you craft policy that sends the signal, that's the dog whistle, that you're anti civil rights, anti Black, and do so in a way, though, that doesn't cross that line of saying the N word, like that would be okay in the 1950s. And that became the policy that you see implemented by the Republicans. And it was designed as a way to, as I said, to break the solid Democratic South, to be able to get those votes in Congress that could move forward a conservative agenda because they believed that they could control this group. But you can't control the virus of white supremacy. It is toxic. And so when the Republicans wooed the white supremacists in, wooed in the solid Democratic South, it slowly took over. It took over with law and order. It took over with welfare queens. It took over with the Willie Horton ad. It took over to the point where you have folks talking to the point where the party is so right wing that Liz Cheney is not right wing enough for it anymore. That gives you a sense of how far to the right the Republicans have moved. And so foundational to that move to the right is anti Blackness, is anti civil rights.
I'm wondering, there are times in America where we have managed institutional pro democracy reforms. What was happening in the country at during those times, and can we take any lessons from those moments in terms of how to foster uh, more reform in the country?
You had a convergence of things happening. And I think one of the big ones that happened during the civil rights movement is you had the Cold War, where the US was really trying to strut on the international stage as the leader of the free world, as this bastion of democracy. And every time there was a lynching, every time there was a case of Southern justice, where somebody was accused and there was no evidence, but that person was then executed. The Soviets had a field day on that. And it made it really hard to explain how the leader of the free world could allow this to happen and there be no consequences for that destruction of Black life. And you saw the US beginning to try to figure out how do we maneuver this thing. And you had the pressure from major grassroots organizing happening with the civil rights movement that understood how important it was for America to project its democracy on the international stage and then live up to it. And so that was the pressure coming from the civil rights movement. That is where you saw this fusion of the needs of the Black community for civil rights and the needs of the American government to look like a strong, viable democracy because its foreign policy, its international stature depended upon it. We're in that same place now. I've heard from people who have been overseas, as have I, and they looked at January 6th and they were horrified. They could not believe that that was happening in the United States of America. And this is one of the things that I think with all of the massive grassroots organizing that is happening now, with people becoming aware of how tenuous democracy is in the United States and how important the upcoming election is in 2024. What does that mean? Are we going to have a democracy after 2024? Nobody wants to live into that dystopian world. Nobody who values democracy, who values America, who values this nation, who values what this nation could be wants that. And so you're seeing that kind of organizing, that kind of mobilizing from attorneys, from grassroots organizations who are working really hard in order to make this nation as viable as it can be.
So, what can American history tell us about the resiliency of American democracy? Is this a moment that is unprecedented, or do we have a lot of other experiences in our American history to sort of lead us into this?
I believe that Um, we every time that America has been on the line, every time there has been a threat to the United States of America, American democracy, you have seen the people who believe in this nation fight back and push back those forces of 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 disintegration, push back those forces of annihilation, push back those forces of of white supremacy, push back those forces who do not believe in all that this nation could be and do not believe in all that its people could be. You have seen Americans, real Americans, push back and organize and fight for this nation. We have a history of that. And this is what I believe we're doing right now, fighting back, fighting for this nation. We will survive and we will thrive because we don't want that kind of Herrenvolk democracy that is the vision that's trying to be stuffed down our throats from January 6th. That Herrenvolk democracy is one where you have a vast rightless labor pool that generates enormous resources, where those resources flow up to a small strata of whites, and everybody else is left scrambling, striving, thriving, drowning. That's not the vision of America. And so you have people fighting back for a fuller, more vibrant, more right-filled America, more a justice system that actually works, where there is accountability, where you have um, where you work hard and you get the rewards for that hard work. That's the vision. It's a vibrant multiracial democracy where the work that we put in are the benefits that we receive.
This is such a fascinating conversation. I wish we had more time, but I'm afraid we have run out. Professor Carol Anderson, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much, Sarah. I really appreciate this.
And thank you to the audience for joining. I want to make one mention that Nicole Hemmer was supposed to join us for this conversation, but due to a scheduling conflict, she was not able to be here. But we have wonderful interviews coming up, and I urge you to go to WashingtonPostLive.com to register for them. We hope to see you. I'm Sarah Ellison, and have a great day.